All right. Good evening again, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Tonight's program on the future of online government meetings will be provided in both English and Spanish. So everyone joining us tonight must choose one of those two languages by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen. There's also instructions on how to do so waiting for you in the chat. Before I introduce you to our guests this evening, a couple brief announcements. We welcome your questions throughout the presentation tonight. We want it to be conversational. We want everyone to be engaged. So please use the Q&A function to ask all of your questions. And then throughout the program, I'll see those submitted questions and then ask you to unmute yourself to speak directly with our panelists. The chat function is also available to you if you'd like to provide any additional commentary on the topics we discuss or share resources relevant to our discussion. I'd also like to thank the many organizations who have made this presentation possible. The League of Women Voters of Rhode Island, the ACLU of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Press Association, Common Cause Rhode Island, and NEFAC, who are all part of Access Rhode Island. Our topic tonight is an especially timely one given the celebration of Sunshine Week this month. Every March, citizens and advocacy organizations across the country honor government transparency by hosting workshops and events such as this one on the topic of public records and, as we'll discuss tonight, open meeting laws. I encourage everyone to learn more about Sunshine Week by visiting the websites of our sponsoring organizations or checking out sunshineweek.org. All right, let's get to it. We have a lot to cover in the next hour. Joining us tonight is Jordan Day of the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns. Jordan's going to help us understand the experiences of municipalities hosting remote meetings, what's worked, what could use some improvement. John Marion at Common Cause Rhode Island. He's going to catch us up to speed on efforts to require remote access and participation to government meetings, and he'll describe various bills being considered to change our open meeting law. Scott Pickering of East Bay Newspapers. He'll provide the perspective of journalists who are using remote access to enhance their news coverage and better inform our communities. Scott also has the experience of working on public boards, so I look forward to hearing more from that perspective as well. We also have Liz Tanner at the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation. Liz can give us a look at how state agencies are managing remote meeting technology and what the future of government meetings may look like on the state level. Thank you all for being here. John, let's begin with you. Catch us up to speed on how we got here. What efforts were made prior to this pandemic, prior to 2020, to provide remote access and participation? And how did we get from there to where we are now?
Great. Thank you for moderating this, Justin. Thank you to all the other panelists for being with us tonight. Everybody in the audience who's taking some time out of their evening to be here with us tonight. So I'm going to start really at the beginning, right? So pardon me if you're very aware of this, but public bodies in Rhode Island are governed by a law called the Open Meetings Act. And I just kind of want to center us around that law because it's going to be brought up a lot tonight. We call it the OMA for short. So when you hear the OMA, we're talking about the law in Chapter 46 of Title 42 of the Rhode Island General Laws that governs how all public bodies in the state, except the state legislature, have to have their meetings. And I'm going to try to do two things at once and put a link to that in the chat for you. So, hey, there we go. So prior to March of 2020, in the onset of the pandemic, the OMA was silent about whether these public bodies need to provide an opportunity for the public to view and participate in public meetings remotely. Back in 2016, I actually did some research that showed about 50% of cities and towns had for their city or town council or their school committee were live streaming their meetings or recording their meetings and putting them online afterward on something like YouTube. So we were seeing some municipalities in the state trying to provide some remote access to public meetings. To the best of my knowledge, none of them allowed the public to participate. So it was very passive, that the public in some of these communities could watch a meeting but not participate remotely. But it is allowed under the law prior to March 2020. Also prior to March 2020, the OMA prohibited the members of the public body from participating in meetings remotely. So that is your city councilors or your town councilors or your school committee members. They, prior to March 2020, couldn't participate remotely with two exceptions: if they were in the military, deployed overseas, or if they had a qualified disability. But that was very, very few people who took advantage of those exceptions in the law. And so, for the most part, public meetings in Rhode Island were being held completely in person, with all members of the public body there in person and all members of the public there in person. In March 2020, when the pandemic hit, Governor Raimondo issued an executive order that lifted the restriction on the members of the public body from participating remotely. So it allowed those members to start coming into a meeting like I am here tonight. And it required that every public body in the state provide what they called adequate alternative means of access and participation by the public. So that was defined as basically telephone or video conference access to the meeting. That meant public bodies could have meetings like this that are fully virtual, or it meant that public bodies could have what we refer to as hybrid meetings, where some or all of the members of the public body were there in person, but they were still providing remote access and participation for the public. That participation was only required if the law required participation for that public body. So people commonly think that there is a law in Rhode Island that says every public meeting must have a public comment period. That is actually not true. But there are some laws for specific public bodies, for instance, that require them. So here in the chat is that first executive order that Governor Raimondo issued. So many of the groups sponsoring this event tonight requested that Governor Raimondo put some public interest safeguards in place, and her administration did issue guidance that incorporated most of our suggestions, though the executive order itself wasn't amended. Director Tanner is going to speak to some of the implementation challenges that state government faced in those early days. During the 2021 legislative session, so the first time the legislature met for an extended period after the pandemic, Director Tanner's office introduced a bill that tried to take the executive order and extend it by law so that it didn't expire every 30 days. So executive orders by law can be no longer than 30 days. And so there was an effort last year during the legislative session to create a piece of legislation that would extend the executive order for a fixed period of time. So bills that are only for a fixed period of time are called sunset bills. And I'll try to put that in the chat as well. That bill, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a minute, or excuse me, later in the program. That bill passed the House of Representatives, but did not pass the Senate. And so in July of 2021, Governor McKee let the executive order expire, and Rhode Island was ushered back into the era of fully in-person meetings again. And as you remember, that was kind of a point where the pandemic seemed to be waning quite a bit. There were still some folks asking for online public meetings, but there wasn't a big cry for it back last July. But as the year went on last year, and we got the Delta variant and then the Omicron variant, there certainly was a desire. Our open government group sent Governor McKee a letter asking for a new executive order. And then in January of this year, he issued another executive order that very similar to that first executive order, allowed for online or hybrid meetings, and in all instances required the adequate alternative means. Recently, in February, the governor did the first real amendment to the executive order, so that the current executive order, which again, I'll try to put in the chat, that one allows for online or hybrid meetings, but it says that if an online meeting or an in-person meeting happens now, they don't have to provide adequate alternative means. So right now we have two types of public meetings that can happen. We have pre-March 2020 meetings, which are just all in person, both the members of the body and the public. And then we have hybrid or fully virtual meetings where some or all people are participating online. So that's going to expire next week, March 31st. So the way I look at it is, of the last 2 years, about 18 of the 24 months, we've had some form of online public meetings. I'll talk next time I talk a little bit about what the legislature is up to this year. Really briefly, I just want to mention, I'm kind of giving voice to the public interest groups here. There have been some great benefits we've seen from this very sudden switch. From a public interest perspective, online meetings have really opened up the public meetings to a lot of people who otherwise never attend public meetings. So parents getting dinner for their children are going to school board meetings in ways that many never did before. Residents whose first language is Spanish are taking advantage of some public bodies are providing interpretation, as we are tonight, and they're taking advantage and even participating in their native language in some instances. And I'll just remind you, if you joined us recently and haven't selected a language, you can go to the bottom and select a language. And we're seeing other advantages. Experts are coming from out of state sometimes to testify at public meetings, and they wouldn't be flying in. I'm testifying at a hearing in Connecticut on Friday, for instance. There have been negative consequences, and this is my last point. We've seen public officials mute people when they don't like what they're hearing from people. We've seen public officials discuss documents, in fact, vote on the City of Providence's budget when it wasn't available to people in the audience because it was being held online. And we've seen, and we know that there's a portion of the population that doesn't have internet access or good internet access, and for fully virtual meetings, they're not able to participate. So, from my organization's perspective, and I think probably from all the public interest groups here, we want to see policies, permanent policies, that really capture the good things that we've seen and learned about these online meetings while restricting these bad practices. So I know I've gone over time. I apologize. I will pause there.
All right. Thank you, John. Having that context is really helpful. And just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A function to submit those questions, and then we'll call on you to address the panelists directly. So to state the obvious, we've had a lot of changes over the last couple of years, new world, different circumstances here, but a lot of opportunity, and yet still some challenges remain as far as remote access and participation. Liz, what have the last 2 years looked like from your perspective on a state level? How have state agencies and public bodies been managing these changes?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, John, for inviting me. It's great to be on a panel with these other esteemed panelists. So it was really interesting for us in the beginning. The whole world falls apart, everything shuts down. And very early on in the pandemic, there was a need to handle municipal concerns. And I had been working with municipalities quite a bit already. My husband's a town planner, so I was very familiar with some of their concerns. I'm also a former real estate attorney and have worked in the title insurance field. So I was getting all these inquiries from the municipalities. What are we going to do? I was getting calls really focused a lot on how are we going to record documents in town halls. And what I was hearing from some of the municipalities was, we're just going to close. We're not going to do anything. And we're just going to wait till this is all over in a couple of weeks, and then we'll open back up. And it quickly became obvious to all of us that this was not just going to be a couple week thing. So what we did very, very quickly was to create this ability to get a Zoom license, right? And so I have to tell you, I had always been focused on using Skype in the past, right? We had presented laws in the past to allow for Skype participation. So the Zoom thing was, just a complete unknown to us. So we were able to very quickly secure a sizable number of Zoom licenses, which we then gave for free to the municipalities. But of course, their first question was, well, how do we use it? What is this thing? And so I'm very blessed to have on my staff an attorney named Amy Stewart, who was formerly with the Ethics Commission, and she's very familiar with this topic. So this was something that she took a lead on, and she worked very closely with the City of Providence, who had started to already work on a guide of sorts. And so she worked with the City of Providence and a bunch of other folks to create a guide so that you at least had some basic information. She also, in addition to her day job, answered probably hundreds of inquiries from everyone under the sun trying to figure this out. And then we also did some webinars as well. So by just coincidence, we realized that there was a need, and we did it. And so we set up all these resources that were available to the businesses. And we ultimately ended up purchasing the best Zoom license that you can get. And then we have now provided them to the municipalities to pay for at an extremely discounted rate that they wouldn't be eligible to get if they tried to get themselves. So the state bought them all for the municipalities, and then they can have municipalities pretty much get to have as many as they want. So that's something else we secured. And I guess I can't say enough, what we did in such an incredibly short amount of time with things that are just impossible to do, so doing that kind of a purchase, that's a many, many months long thing. And I think it took us maybe a week, 2 weeks to do it. So I have to say that doing what we did in such a short amount of time to allow government to resume, not just municipal government, but state government as well, was probably one of the most, I have an enormous sense of pride for what we did, because it was really incredible what was able to happen. Because we heard amazing stories about how Massachusetts just came to a halt. They were unable to do things as fast as we did. So it's something I'm very proud of, not just for Amy and the team, but for all the folks that were involved. So it was really quite incredible.
So with our eye on the future of online government meetings, what's on your to-do list on the state level as far as moving forward? What are some of the challenges that you're looking to meet, and or what are some of the resources you're looking to provide?
So I'll tell you some of the challenges that we really heard. First and foremost was trying to get the equipment, right? So they had a Zoom license, but trying to have a meeting, they couldn't get the cameras, they couldn't get the screens, they couldn't get the microphones because of a huge supply chain issue. So that was, first and foremost was, okay, this is great, I'm willing to do this, but I can't even get the equipment, right? And so I know that some folks are still suffering that problem as well. The second, and probably the biggest issue that we hear is, that's great, I will try to figure this out, but I don't know how to do this, right? Like who's going to run the camera? Who's going to run the machine? Who's going to figure out how to do all this stuff? So, so there is an increased cost to some municipalities, to some of these boards, to some of these state agencies, because they have to bring somebody in because they just don't have the tech savvy people in their office. So that's really been probably the biggest issue that we hear is because it takes time, right? It's a new piece of software in theory. And so, even my husband who runs his own meetings, it took him, probably a half dozen meetings until he was able to really feel more comfortable. And so now they don't necessarily need to have an IT staff person on every meeting that he runs, but it took him a while to bring up to speed, and others will have to do that too. And then the third thing is the camera. So if you're using a camera, how do you use your camera? Does it show the whole board? Does it show part of the board? Do you try to focus it on one person? Is it fast enough to move that way if the conversation goes back and forth? So there's all of those sort of logistical issues too, that are ongoing. But it's just a matter of you have to keep doing it and keep trying it, and then you kind of overcome it. But those are some of the examples that we've heard from.
Great. And Jordan, I'm going to go to you in just a moment to discuss, what's happening on the local level. But Liz, if you could, before I move to Jordan, just tell us a little bit about. Well, I guess I should acknowledge that not all state agencies are the same size. They don't have the same scope of mission. They might be experiencing this in different ways. Maybe you can give us a little bit of insight there. What are the differences between various state agencies, and does that matter when we're talking about providing remote access and participation moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it depends, right? So there are over 3,800 boards and commissions in the state, 3,800, right? Think about that. Less than 200 of them have members that are elected. The majority of these boards are just people who are volunteers who meet at nights or sometimes during the day to offer up their expertise or the kindness of their hearts to make decisions that benefit all of us as Rhode Islanders, right? And so, as volunteers, they don't get paid to do this, right? And sometimes they have to spend hours upon hours to prepare for whatever their meeting is. And so, this was always a concern of mine before COVID, was getting a quorum, right? So whether it's a state board or municipal board, any other board, trying to get a quorum is really hard, particularly if it's a community where you have a lot of senior citizens who might be away in the winter, right? Like that happens all the time, which is why from an economic development standpoint, this had always been a problem, because you can't get a quorum. The next thing you know, you can't do anything. You can't build the garage or put a roof on your house because you've had to wait the entire winter until you could get a new board. So we're blessed at DBR. We don't have a ton of public participation, so that hasn't been too much of a problem for us. But there's a big difference between a council where there's always people participating and the Bristol 4th of July committee where there's just people volunteering talking about the parade, right? So there really needs to be consideration for each one of them. So it really just depends.
Thank you, Liz. Jordan, have you seen similar experiences on a local level? What's it looked like within municipalities as they've tried to navigate this new remote access and participation requirements?
Thanks, Justin. I think to Liz's point, there's a lot of operational challenges when it comes to staffing and capacity. There are 39 very unique communities, and they all have their own limitations and capacity issues that they struggle to deal with every day. I know John brought up one example about the city of Providence. They have a full clerk's office of 15 to 20 staff people. That is not common in most communities. And so their public meetings are all consistently staffed. Not that speaks to the poor document sharing that they did recently. But I do think that all of them have the same struggle of how can we manage more so the hybrid aspect of meetings. That's really where they come into a gray area for them. And that's, I think, part of the reason why they're so hesitant to commit one way or another, is that if they continue forward and people become more comfortable with the hybrid fashion, they're concerned about staffing, equipment, what that looks like, and how that financially plays out for them in the long run. If there's a full-time staff person that's running these meetings, do they get paid overtime, benefits, all these questions that I think the average person isn't thinking about. They're like, no, it's just a camera. It's not always just a camera. And some communities like Situate, Rhode Island, of all communities, has been way ahead of everyone for quite some time, offering virtual access, not participation, but virtual access to their meetings, where you could watch their meetings for a really long time and not be there. I think when it comes to virtual participation, there's still also the question about how to properly make sure that you're engaging with the public. Several communities are trying to make sure that they're following an order, doing certain things. Do people have to sign up ahead of time? It's a lot of logistics, things that they hadn't had to think about in the past, because people would show up, they'd come, they'd talk. I think that that's very interesting. And I think for a lot of communities, they do see the cost and implementation as a barrier. And so, I mean, I know right now that there is someone on this, watching this right now, who's also at another virtual meeting for a city or town. And like, that's the benefit, is that they can be in two places at once. I personally have benefited from it. I've testified before city councils before, from the comfort of my couch. I'm participating right now from the comfort of my couch. I think that people see that as the benefit, but I also think that they still worry about that implementation, even though they know that there are some resources. They just worry about the longevity of that.
Jordan, let's talk about the implementation for a little bit. You know, those towns that you mentioned, Situate, those that are providing the remote access, those that seem to have those blocks in place to make this happen. How did they get to where they are? And those towns that are struggling to figure out how to provide, as you mentioned, hybrid access, you know, what needs to be in place for them in order to make it happen?
That's a good question. and I don't think I can answer it for all 39, but for what I have heard from varying communities, Situate was ahead of the game. They had been doing this virtual access, virtual availability for years prior. So they had already absorbed that implementation cost. I think for communities now, when they were posed the question about implementing a statewide virtual meeting access possibility, they were thinking, we've already seen fall in revenue, we've already experienced these significant losses financially. How can we get there? And so one of the ways that we tried to work with communities, and that's how some communities have been able to implement either virtual or hybrid meetings, is ensuring that they're eligible to use their American Rescue Plan Act funds. That was one avenue that folks could use in order to be able to pay for that type of infrastructure. Another area of concern is just supply chain. My brother works in Hasbro, and I think he was telling me last October, it's going to take a while for you to get your holiday gifts, so order early. There are communities that ordered supplies last fall or winter that still have yet to receive them. And that's because of those supply chain issues. And so those are things that are utterly out of our control. I think the last and most important piece is that a lot of boards like actually participating in person. And I don't know the reason or the rationale. And I can't say exactly why, but I do think that they feel that in-person participation is better for their community. And there are lots of reasons why they might think that. I know that there's probably folks out there who have felt that they've benefited, and I like I said, I myself have benefited from having virtual access. But I also think that some of our boards have experienced really terrible moments where they have had someone come in and say incredibly racist things and traumatize people in a way that shouldn't have happened. And so they're fearful of stuff like that. And that doesn't happen all the time. We've all learned a lot since the first days of Zoom, right? But I think that's a memory that a lot of folks have. And so I do think that there's a little bit more of a control aspect, that when they're in the room, those are the people that are their voters, the residents, the people who are in their communities coming out to weigh in. And not that people who were on the phones weren't, it's just the folks that are present definitely are.
Got it. Thank you, Jordan. Scott, I want to go to you next because we're hearing about all of these challenges that either at the state level or municipal level, we're facing implementing remote access and participation. And we don't yet have a requirement by law that says that this needs to be required. So if we can't get to that point, if we can't figure out a way to get to that destination and make sure that all citizens have remote access and participation, what, particularly in your view from the newsroom, what do we stand to lose?
Well, thanks for the question, Justin. So one thing that makes it difficult going last is I've heard so much leading up to this that I want to talk about. But so hopefully, first and foremost, I'm actually here representing the public. And then I have a couple points that are specific to journalists and newsrooms. But I just wanted to go back to what Liz said and echo what she said, that in the early days of the pandemic, it was remarkable how quickly Rhode Island governments kept working. And I even wrote an editorial complimenting it, that it was one of the true early obvious silver linings to the pandemic was how well government pivoted and went in a new direction and figured out how to do it. And there was really almost no interruption. Zoning boards and planning boards and councils and school committees all turned on a dime. And it really was spectacular to see. And in the beginning, it was just the government there. They all moved online and a couple of journalists were watching. And what ended up happening is fairly quickly, over the period of several months, the public started to notice and suddenly realized these things were happening and they were accessible. And like John said, you could stay at home and make dinner with the kids, or put your kids to bed, or walk around in your sweatpants and watch a public meeting. And it was phenomenal. I mean, it was eye-opening. I started doing it just as a resident in my community in Barrington, just watching meetings that I wasn't covering, but just taking part as a member of the public. And before I knew it, I was jumping in and commenting in the public comment sessions. And what happened was this just wonderful, I personally think it was the most, we saw more public engagement in these meetings than we've seen in a few generations. I mean, in the beginning of our democracy, this was government. It was a town meeting and everyone walked, through the streets of the village and met at the town hall and they voted on important decisions. And then we've obviously drifted away from that. I, as a journalist in my early days, would sit in a meeting with myself, 5 board members, and the 2 gadflies and watch a meeting that nobody saw, nobody was interested in. And what we've seen is a complete turnaround in public engagement, public interest, accountability, transparency. I mean, all wonderful things that have happened, I think. And so there have been negatives, without a doubt. I feel most of them are early on, and there's been a lot of learning that's taking place. And Liz spoke to that. She said, or her husband went through a dozen meetings before he got to the point where he feels fully confident in being able to run one. So there's a bit of a learning curve. But if you take the whole of it, and the good and the bad, and take the net in my mind is overwhelmingly positive, that the level of public engagement has improved to a point that I think it's good for our state, it's good for our communities. The net is definitely positive. I have a few more points, but I'll let you ask another question if you'd like.
Yeah, actually, I have one question here from the audience. I'm going to ask DH if you could go ahead and ask your question about just how to best represent a community through exclusively in-person meetings. DH, please share your thoughts.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, you can call me Di, and I live in Situate and posted the link to this meeting here. So I hope that there are other Situate residents that have attended. I had a couple of thoughts that I thought why we really do need to have these types of meetings. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so the first thing is a full house in a meeting room, even with a maximum of 250 people, does not and cannot represent all of the residents of our town, especially when votes occur. So if we have a meeting in a high school auditorium, the maximum amount of people, even with people outside on a nice warm day, is not going to be representative when votes are occurring of all the people in the voting residents of the town. And so I think that it's really crucial to have these types of meetings, even if they have recorded meetings and alongside Zoom meetings, where we can also capture those nuances where public comments are discussed, even argued, and not really put anywhere in the meeting minutes. Another advantage is that you can also use that as a transcript. If they're recorded, you can also get that information without having to pay a couple $100 to get a paid for transcript by whoever's taking it. Many of the meeting minutes in most towns say refer to the transcripts or refer to the video. So it can be difficult for people to know how to even access that. Some of websites aren't constructed as well as others. Recorded Zoom meetings will offer actual evidence of what people say surrounding the content of the discussion versus hearsay in newspaper or Facebook pages. So it doesn't leave much to interpretation. You get to see exactly what happened, when, and why. Also, they give a clearer picture of how the town is being run and showing whether the voices of the residents are being heard. In many cases where there have been full houses and people have objected to things, and the powers that be at that particular time voted their way instead, then people can get a good idea of how they can try to go forward and come together as a business, and the residents, the town folk can work together to see if they can come to some kind of agreements that, what's important, not just, the fact that they are the power and we are the residents, but we have to be partnership. And I think these Zoom meetings will bring a good partnership to these kinds of events.
Thank you, Doug. We do have a few other questions I want to get to. So if we could leave it there, and I want to bring it back to you, Scott, to
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doug, appreciate it. To Doug's point, if we don't have this remote access and participation, if we're going back to the way that it once was, can we accurately reflect ourselves as a community if we're limiting our attendance at these meetings to in-person only?
I would argue that it's sort of like the genie's out of the bottle, and you're not going to get it back in, or you shouldn't try to get it back in. And so, sure, we can go back to the way it was, and I think it would be a step back for our communities to do so, because we've seen interest, engagement, ideas coming forward that we haven't seen, like I said, in a few generations. So I hope we don't go backwards because of all the net positives that have come from it. But I also, to sort of respond to some of what Jordan had to say, I think a lot of those objections or concerns that were raised are or at least should be short-term problems, all of which could be overcome. And I would actually say shame on some communities that they haven't yet, 2 years into this, overcome these. I watched the town of Bristol, which was an early adopter, closed its town hall, reopened it 3 months later, and had a new audiovisual system installed for not a lot of money, and made the investment in a really high quality program with mounted screens and mics, and did that in the summer of 2020. So, but even having said that, I understand if they haven't made the investments now and they can't get the equipment, then there needs to be some timeline for adoption and investments to play out and actually get the setup that's needed. I would advocate that long-term, we should all be going in the direction of, hey, this has been a great thing. It's in re-energized interest in our government and its activities. And every community should have at least one dedicated physical resource, whether it's at the library or at the town hall or at the high school. Have one facility that is a set up, equipped room meeting space for all the big boards and all the little boards. And you mentioned I don't have a lot of other roles, but I do help chair one public body, a special education advisory committee to the school district. And we have use of the middle school room in Barrington, which was part of a brand new middle school that was built, a wonderful room, installed mics, installed screen. It's a great resource, and we use it complimentary from courtesy of the school district. If every community had a room like that various groups could use, it's really what we should come to expect from every community. It'd be a great resource. And I think that should be a goal for every community to get to, that their major bodies are meeting in, providing access to the public, but also smaller bodies can take advantage of, as long as it's under reasonable circumstances.
Thanks. And Jordan and Liz, I'm going to get to you in just a moment because I would like to hear from you, your reaction to these suggestions that Scott has and what your vision is moving forward. But first, I want to hear from you, John, about any current proposals or legislative attempts to come up with a solution, a workable solution that we can implement that will allow remote access and participation without imposing unreasonable burdens on the state or municipalities.
Thanks again, Justin. So, and thanks to everybody who's putting stuff in the chat. Particularly Michelle from New York is sharing what she's trying to do in my home state of New York. Yeah, I mentioned previously there were bills last year. One passed the House, but not the Senate. There are again very, very similar bills in 2022 to what we saw in the legislature last year. The difference is the House bill would sunset this July 1st, and the Senate bill would sunset July 1st of next year. If those bills would allow, they would essentially extend the executive order, allowing fully remote meetings or hybrid meetings or in-person meetings, but requiring an instance when there's a fully remote meeting or a hybrid meeting that the public have that adequate alternative means. The legislation would also require 5 particular public bodies, city and town councils, school committees, zoning and planning boards, and quasi-public agencies to provide remote access even if that body meets fully in person. So it actually goes beyond the current executive order. It includes some of the safeguards that I talked about earlier, including, but I'm not going to go through this, I have a huge long bulleted list, putting on the agenda, how to get into the virtual meeting, making sure it's at no cost, making sure that the people participating remotely can participate in the same way that people who are there in person, requiring that votes being held by the public body can be seen by the public who's watching online. Just giving voice to the advocates here briefly, it doesn't include some things that we do want in terms of safeguards. So it allows for conference call meetings, and we really think video technology has matured and become cheap enough that we really shouldn't be having conference calls anymore. We'd like to see the recordings have to be put online right after the meeting, instead of just accessible to the public if they request it, and a few other what we call guardrails. So, Common Cause, I know some of the other sponsoring organizations have been advocating at the legislature to try to get those bills both moving, but also amended to reflect more of what we want. We've also come to this conclusion in the open government community that there are some public bodies that, for reasons really of accountability, should be meeting in person, even if they're going to provide remote access and participation to the public. And thank you, Amy, for putting the bill links to the bills in the chat. Elected bodies. So essentially, if you run for public office, we don't think you should duck accountability by having a remote meeting if you're going to take a difficult vote. And so elected bodies should be meeting in person. And of course, with if the pandemic ramps up again or another emergency, provide an out for even those bodies to be fully online. So I'll just wrap up. I'm a little pessimistic that these things are going to move, right? They're certainly not going to pass before March 31st, and this executive order is supposed to expire on March 31st. But I'm hopeful that maybe if the executive order does expire on March 31st, people will contact their legislators and say, we need some of these things. We want some of these things back. Particularly the state Senate, which didn't act last year. And we hope when people speak up, they sort of give voice to the public's perspective on putting in place good guardrails for some of those things that we want to see. And I'll just reiterate the point I made in the chat, which is even if nothing passes, even if the executive order lapses or expires, you can go to your city council and say, I think you should put your meetings online. And as I said, in 2016, about half of them already were. And almost all of them have now, probably invested in some technology that would allow them to at least record and put them online, if not live stream them, if not allow remote participation. So I think it's going to take, residents of Rhode Island sort of demanding this of their legislature and of their communities to step up. That doesn't solve, Liz is coming and Jordan's coming from the government perspective, that doesn't allow the members of the public body to participate remotely. And we do think there is a role in limited instances, such as Scott's, special ed advisory body, to be meeting online and let them participate that way as well.
Great. So let's get back to the government perspective. First, again, a final reminder to get your questions in. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you do have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A. Jordan, you've heard the thoughts of Scott and the suggestions that he's made. You've heard John go through various legislative attempts and what those bills would require by law. Does this sound reasonable to you? And if there are aspects of these suggestions and bills that don't seem reasonable, what are your remaining concerns?
Yeah, so I think that people who don't work in government don't necessarily understand how challenging it is sometimes. You do though, like that's the other thing is like, how hard it is to make your elected and appointed officials get things done or move them in a certain direction. And even working in a municipality, I've done it before. I suggest everyone do it for at least a year. It's a lot of fun. But I think when it comes down to it, there's a lot of work that they need to do. And there's a lot of support mechanisms that need to be put in place. I think people underestimate the amount of work that is in there. When you're renovating a building built in the 1800s for a modern audio-visual system, what does that look like? That's a lot of work and it takes time. There are historic rules that you may have to follow. I know one community was going through that recently. It's not that I think that it's not that a lot of communities don't want to. I think they're just trying to figure out the how. And the how is going to take a little bit of time. And I think it's interesting to hear some communities were super ahead of the game, like they lucked out, but we are where we are now. And we can't, woulda, coulda, shoulda is really, it's too bad that we weren't able to get what we needed or have the funds that we needed way back when. A lot of communities are still struggling. So that's kind of on the implementation side of things where I come from. As far as the bills that are before the General Assembly, the league submitted testimony last year, and it will be consistent because it's very similar. We're generally supportive. I think the concern for us is that we, of course, would like this to be optional. Cities and towns don't like having mandates put upon them because every community is different. Everyone has different implementation challenges. And so for them, having it be optional gives them the opportunity to move at their own pace and work in over time. I mean, the e-permitting process is a good example, and that's also under Liz's purview. Don't want to talk about that tonight. But the e-permitting is a good example. They incentivized it. There are 31 communities, 32 communities that are on board. It was made mandatory last year, and there's a 2 to 3 year phase in. If we made it optional or incentivized it, I think that that would be a great opportunity to get a majority of communities on board. The other thing is that I like that we've limited it to those 5 key groups, because really when it comes down to it, those are really powerful decision-making bodies that have a lot of public responsibility. And I think that those are the 5 key groups, if we had to deal with a mandate, we would be more comfortable with. And so we understand that. The last thing I'll say is, and John and I are dear friends, so he knows what I'm about to say, I think, is that we appreciate the need for guardrails. We totally get that people abuse the privilege of being virtually available or remotely participating. And yes, to Michelle's point, there's an opportunity and an opening for abuses of the system, whether it's optional or not. And I think that where we come from is that we would like to see the guardrails put into some really stringent regulations versus codified in law, because a city or town clerk can't control whether or not I, Jordan Day, have my camera on if I'm participating remotely. And so holding that public body accountable for something like that just presents a lot of challenges. But I do understand the need for having them in place.
Thank you. Liz, I'm going to go to you for final thoughts in just a second. But John, it looks like we might need a little clarity on why it's so important to have some, if not all, public bodies meet in person. Why is that a good method to maintaining accountability over having these bodies meet exclusively online?
Yeah, and I'll mention, this is an exciting area to work in because it doesn't fall along ideological lines. Like I've discovered as I engage people on this topic that, one, their opinions have changed as the course of the pandemic has gone on, which is fascinating because most people's opinions are kind of baked in and they never change. And two, I know very conservative people who agree with some of the most liberal people in my life on certain aspects of this, and other people they're opposite but are ideologically polar opposites. So that's interesting, but also a challenge, right? From a sort of public interest perspective, which is where I sit, bodies that are elected, are the foundation of our democracy. They hold usually the most power over our lives, taxing power and other things. And so those who are most powerful need to be held most accountable. And fully remote meetings are where we worry most about the accountability, right? So it's the ability of Scott, when the meeting's concluding and they've taken a controversial vote, to go up and ask the chair of the committee or the town council, like, why did you take that vote tonight, right? If they can go fully remote, Scott can't do that. The town council president can press the leave meeting button or close meeting button at the end and disappear. And, or just really kind of seeing the public sitting in front of them, trying to sort of just express their support or opposition to an issue on the agenda. That's important. We recognize that not all public bodies are the Providence City Council, right? The Bristol 4th of July Committee, I went to one of their meetings. It was hilarious because I was the only outsider. And they noticed me on the Zoom and were like, oh, look, we have a guest. And, they're not raising people's taxes in Bristol. Letting them meet online doesn't seem to sort of hurt democratic accountability in our government. So there is a difference. The current law treats everybody the same. It treats the Narragansett Bay Commission, which spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year, the same as Scott's Special Education Advisory Board. And the law can be more sensitive to that.
So Liz, to John's point, not all public bodies are the same. So what would you like to see? How should we move forward from here? What should we be doing?
Yeah, it's something we've been struggling with. Amy has been a part of a group trying to analyze this. And so, I'll say that this opinion is mine. It's not one of the administration. But I'll say that, just like John and Jordan, and I think even Scott said, the 3,600 versus the 200, they should not necessarily be treated the same, right? And so, that's the first part of it. The whole reason that I'm even interested in this and have been before even COVID was the quorum piece, right? So to me, if you still want to meet in person, that's great. But to a certain extent, I'd like to see a body be required to meet if they haven't been able to meet for 1-2 meetings. I'm not sure what the number is there, so that they are required to have a quorum so that they can then take an action upon whatever it might be, right? Because that's something that I care a lot about, is the delay of government from happening. But I think the biggest thing is you're going to have bad apples on both sides, right? You're going to have people who are coming who are going to be bad apples and trying to ruin a meeting, whether it's in person or whether it's virtual, right? And you're going to have bad apples in bodies who are trying to get around not listening to the public, right? And so you're going to have bad apples on both sides. And I'm a big advocate for not drafting and passing legislation that addresses the bad apples, because I'd like people to do the right thing. But I have to admit that this is still too new and we just don't know what's going to happen, right? So it's one of those things where let's pass a law and then we're going to change it and we're going to tweak it and we're going to get it right, and so that's what we've been talking to other states about. We've been talking to see, and we're all as a country, we're all as a world going to try to have to figure this out. So pass a law and we're going to tweak it every year until we get it right. And it's going to take a little while and it's not going to be perfect. And some bad apples are going to get away with whatever they're going to do, but you got bad apples no matter what you've got. So that's kind of my take. And I hope that we do get some legislation passed and then we all just work on it together to address the bad apples.
Thank you. Scott, I'll give you the final word here. Where would you like to see us as far as future of online government meetings?
Well, thank you. I didn't expect that or want that. I would have deferred to Liz, but I do have a few remaining thoughts. I would like to, I agree with the idea that the major bodies, the important authoritative bodies that influence spending and taxes and infrastructure should be meeting in person. It's the most accountable. It's the most transparent way. When they're meeting remotely, you can't tell who's texting whom, who's having side conversations. You can't see the documents they're looking at. So I believe those bodies should be back to meeting in person. I believe the public should have remote access as much as we can feasibly do it and as quickly as we can do it in all communities. And the point about I said I was going to represent journalists. John actually spoke to it. That exact scenario happened to us a week ago in one of our communities where a controversial decision was made on a fully remote meeting held via Zoom. The meeting ended, the chairman hit leave meeting, and we wrote a story about it and then got beat up for the next week because we didn't present, quote, the other side. Meanwhile, we had no access to public officials and no one called us back for 5 days. So we couldn't get any other side. And in normal times, the journalist absolutely walks up to the board members at the end of a meeting and asks a few follow-up questions, gets some insights, gets some background, and has a better understanding of the events often to be able to share with the public. And so we want that to continue, not as a privilege for journalists, but as a public service for the public. It's a really important aspect of the whole dynamic. So I would like to see us back to meeting in person for the important bodies and allowing as much public remote access as we can manage. And I think the public should be held to the same standards online that they are held to in person. They should have their cameras on. They have to be identified who they are. They have to state who they are, and they have to abide by the same decorum that you would expect in person, because I've seen way too many meetings where with jargony screen names in a black screen are out there attacking public officials or venting about something, and we have no way of knowing who they truly are. And so I just think accountability on both sides is the most important thing that we should be going for with as much access as we can.
Thank you, Scott. Well, we are right at 8 o'clock, so we do need to end here. A big thank you to all of you, our panelists, for sharing your perspectives, helping us understand all the considerations at play with remote access and participation to government meetings. I also want to thank everybody in our audience who joined us this evening, making government transparency a priority, learning more, engaging, and really wrestling with these issues about how we move forward here. I appreciate all your support and interest. I should note before we conclude here that those that would like to view this as a recording, later on, one will be made available within the next few days on the websites of Common Cause Rhode Island. They're at commoncause.org/Rhode-Island. And my organization, New England First Amendment Coalition, we're at NEFAC.org. So many thanks to all of you again for joining us this evening. Good night.